day, everybody. My name is Marty Martin. Thanks for the intro, Rhiannon. We're going to talk about flight deck operations today, focusing on the launch sequence, launching fixed-wing aircraft from the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. My name is Marty Martin. I'm a retired P3 NFO and did 23 years in the Navy. And 2 of those years, I was stationed on board USS Kitty Hawk as a catapult and rescue gear officer. So what I'm going to do to get things kicked off today is I'm going to show a short video from Gung Ho Vids, about 2 minutes of a video showing some launch sequences, so that you can kind of get a feel for the pace of the flight deck and what happens on the flight deck and how exciting it can be. For those of you that have never been on a flight deck, this will give you a good idea what it's like. For those of us that have served on the roof, you can just sit back and relax and enjoy and relive your glory days, like I do every time I watch this. So here we go. That's some pretty exciting footage you saw there, and that's the way it is all the time when you're on the flight deck. That's daylight, beautiful day to be on the flight deck. Working on the flight deck, and everybody up on the flight deck is part of a big team. And I've always thought that naval aviation is the ultimate team sport. But working on the flight deck is truly a team effort. And like any team, we have different colors that we wear that define the roles we have on that team. And we're going to go through those roles right now, and we're going to focus on the different colors of jerseys you saw in the videotape. So we're using the exhibit here in the museum to kind of facilitate that discussion. So first off, in our as we call it, rainbow wardrobe, are the purple shirts. Your purple shirts are aviation boats has made fuels. So their job is to fuel and refuel aircraft. And they do anything dealing with aircraft fuel on the ship. If we're doing an unrep with a ship alongside, they take care of getting the fuel from the oiler to the carrier as well. But everything they do revolves around the fuel and the fuel system on the carrier. So those are your purple shirts. We call them affectionately grapes. Next in the lineup are your white shirts. So your white shirts, here depicted here is a white shirt here. He is this gentleman here, I'm assuming he's a gentleman in this picture. It could be a female as well. We have the one thing about the flight deck nowadays from when I was on, we have males and females in all these different roles. And the average age of all these folks on the flight deck, especially the junior enlisted personnel, are in their late teens and early 20s. So we have the white shirts, getting back on track here. White shirts who are your quality control personnel, your plane inspectors. That's what this person doing here is a plane inspector. He's a final checker, troubleshooter, and he's giving a thumbs up as a catapult as far as the aircraft goes down the track. Also, your landing signal officer. When we talk about part 2 of the flight deck operations recovery, we'll learn about landing signal officers and what they do. But they wear a white jersey, white float coat as well. So white is typically associated with safety observers, those types of personnel, and medical as well. Moving on to our red shirts. We have several red shirts in this picture here. You have your air wing, here's your air wing ordnance chief. So he's overseeing all the ordnance activities that the air wing personnel are performing on the air wing aircraft. We also have these two folks. These are crash and salvage. They are also aviation boatswain's mates, handlers, but they are on the crash and salvage team. So their job is to respond to any type of aircraft accident we may have on the flight deck. It could be a crash or a fire. They're also trained to pull the air crew out of the aircraft. So they do those types of work, and they also do salvage. If sometimes in the aircraft carrier, if you have a mishap, you have aircraft that are in the air that need to land. Sometimes the quickest thing to do is to remove that aircraft from the flight deck, and that team is the one that lifts the aircraft and will, in many cases, push it over the side. So that's what they do. Next up, also in the red shirt area, are your ordnance men. So we talked about ordnance, and you all see, here's a picture here. These folks here are your ordnance men for the squadron. And they are the ones that will, before the aircraft is loaded on the catapult and shot, they're the ones that make sure that everything is ready to go. They arm the missiles. If you have forward firing ordnance, they'll arm the missiles, those types of activities. Next in the lineup are your green shirts. Probably in the video you saw a lot of green shirts. The two most prevalent colors you'll see in the video were yellow shirts and green shirts. Because your green shirts are your catapult and arresting gear crews. In the video you saw all of the catapult crews, and they're all wearing green. You also might have seen some air wing maintenance personnel wearing green, and then your GSE folks are wearing green at times. So really, green is a very prevalent color on board the flight deck. Next up are your blue shirts. Now your blue shirts are junior yellow shirts, so they're aviation boatswain's handling as well, but they start out as blue shirts. I saw somebody had a question last night about blue shirts, wanting to know why they were best. And I was a yellow shirt, but a shooter. But I always say the blue shirts. The great thing about being a blue shirt is that they get to be a yellow shirt at some point. But I think if you talk to any of the different colored jerseys, they're all going to say that they're the best. But back to your blue shirts, they're plane handlers. They also drive the tractors on the flight deck and the huffers on the flight deck that provide bleed air to start the engines of the aircraft when it's time to start engines. And in flight deck control, they're messengers and phone talkers. They track the movement of the aircraft on the flight deck and relay that information to the aircraft handler in flight deck control. We also have brown shirts. Our brown shirts are our plane captains. They're part of the air wing, part of the squadron, and they are the ones that service the aircraft both during pre-flight and post-flight. They're usually the person that the air crew will check in with when they come to the aircraft to man the aircraft. And last but not least, yellow shirts. Like I said, the two big colors you see on the flight deck are yellow shirts and green shirts. Your yellow shirts are the ones that move the aircraft about the deck. Any movement of the aircraft is done under the direction of a yellow shirt. And other specialties on the flight deck that wear yellow, the catapult officer or the shooter wears a yellow jersey. The reason you know he's a shooter and not a yellow shirt is he actually wears a green cranial with orange stripes. So it's a little bit different, And then lastly, your plane directors, a senior is a plane director, taxiing an aircraft on the flight deck. All right. So now we've talked about the colors, who everybody is on the team. And when I was a brand new shooter, actually I was beginning my arresting gear training on Kitty Hawk back in 1992. The gentleman who trained me as an arresting gear officer was a lieutenant commander, and he said that the flight deck is a game that is measured in inches and seconds. And I'll always remember that because so many decisions are made with split-second timing, and for the folks moving the aircraft around, it can be measured in inches. That can be the difference between success and failure. So it is a true team sport. Everybody has to be on their A game every day, every evolution. Okay, now we've talked about who does basically what in stationary terms. Now we're going to move to what really happens during the pre-flight and during the launch. So the rest of our talk will be about the steps that go through the pre-launch and then the actual hooking of the aircraft to the catapult. All right, looking at pre-flight, usually about an hour and 15 minutes before the launch time, the aircraft are going to be respotted. So flight deck control and the yellow shirts have gotten together. They brief the launch. They know how many airplanes are going to be, what the composition of airplanes are, And there's an actual sequence that goes. Usually you launch your tankers, your airborne early warning aircraft first. You'll launch the plane guard before those leave, which is a helicopter. They usually go early, about 15 minutes early. They're airborne, orbiting on the starboard side of the ship. And that will happen a little bit later. But that's what they talk about during their brief with the aircraft handler. Everybody comes into flight deck control. The catapult officer, typically when we did it, the bow catapult officer, who's going to shoot the bow catapults, he would get the wind over deck weight sheets from all the squadrons, and during that briefing time, he is determining the wind over deck requirement for that launch, usually based off the heaviest aircraft. And back in the days when I was a shooter, we usually launched tankers, the KA-6D, and of course the F-14 Tomcat, and those were usually your drivers. Usually the tanker was your driver on wind over deck. So you get the wind over deck requirement, and that's given to the folks at flight deck control, and that's radioed up to the bridge where the captain is and the OOD, and they will know how fast to make the ship go to generate the proper amount of wind over deck to launch the aircraft safely. So that's all happening along with the respotting, and then about an hour before launch time, fueling begins. Maintenance is wrapped up by the maintenance personnel, by the squadron maintenance personnel. The ordis, the ordnance, the red shirts, are arming the aircraft. They could be finishing up loads. They could be verifying the loads of the aircraft. And then the air crew make their way from the ready room, intel, make their way up to the flight deck and begin their pre-flight and man the aircraft. At approximately 30 minutes prior to the launch time, the air boss gets on the loudspeaker on the flight deck and goes to a nice cadence. And I don't have it all. I used to have it memorized. But he tells everybody get in the proper flight deck uniform, goggles down, cranials on, float coats on, secured, long sleeves rolled down, gloves, make sure everybody's safety ready to go, goggles down, all those types of things. And then the best part of the whole spiel at the end is start them up. And they'll start up to begin the engine start. So typically you could have between 15 and 20 airplanes on a given launch, depending on what's going to happen. So what happens is those 15 to 20 airplanes all get launched fairly close together in sequence. It's all driven by a number of huffers available, but it actually happens pretty quickly. And what really intensifies on the flight deck is the noise. It gets very loud, it gets very warm. It's already windy because of the wind over the deck, but it gets very loud and very hard to hear anything. So we always assume that any airplane on the flight deck during flight quarters and when start engine is given, that any airplane up there is actually running. Because the flight deck is not like your airport. When you see an airplane start up at an airport, they turn the lights on the airplane, which signifies that they're getting ready to start engines. On the flight deck, we don't do that because we use the lights for a different reason, especially at night. So moving on to starting engines, we've done that. We started the engines, and then about 15 minutes prior, like I said earlier, about 15 minutes prior, we're going to launch that plane guard helicopter. They'll be launched typically off the waist, and then the aircraft will begin to taxi to their various catapults. So that when it's all said and done before launch time, you'll have the catapults loaded probably with the first jet, not connected to the catapult, but will be on top of the catapult, past the JBDs, and then they'll be lined up between the different catapults. So once that goes, we're just waiting for the air boss to give us a green beacon to launch the aircraft. So right now you have a red beacon going to an amber beacon that's on the tower. So while we're talking about different things going on the flight deck, let's go back and talk about different places on the flight deck. The flight deck is like a sports field, and we have different names for different parts of the flight deck. So a little quick familiarization of your flight deck goes as follows. So all of our carriers in our fleet have 4 catapults. So we have Cat 1, Cat 2 on the bow, then Cat 3, and then Cat 4 on the waist. That's called the waist. This is called the waist. This is the bow. We sometimes call this the pointy end of the ship. And then the ship has, the flight deck itself has different names for different parts of the flight deck. And these words are used, these terms and locations are used by the folks on the flight deck or in flight deck control or the air boss that have radio communications amongst each other and the catapult officers. So you have the junkyard as an example. This is where, if you look at the picture of the real carrier, if Donald can show the real carrier, this is your junkyard here. Then you have the point. This is called the point. That's also called the crunch pole or the Belknap pole. There's a story behind that. If we have time, I can go into that. Then you have elevator 1, you have elevator 2, then elevator 3, elevator 4. This is called the street through here. And the reason it's called the street is because when you're launching both bow and waist catapults, it's very busy back there, and it's like a busy city street. Aircraft are going different directions from different positions on the flight deck. Let's see, and then we have JBDs. Somebody had asked about talking about the JBDs. So JBDs are raised after the aircraft taxis into their respective catapult, and when you raise a JBD, it's cooled by salt water, and that salt water cools JBD to keep it cool when the jet exhaust hits it. And you can usually, used to when we launch Tomcats, you put a Tomcat in the burner, usually you could have that have that aircraft in burner for about 30 seconds. That was the limit. If you kept it any longer than 30 seconds, then you start to deform the JBD because of the heat. So that's what the function of the JBD is, and engineering provides that salt water to the JBD. So that's our flight deck lingo and kind of places on the flight deck. So that's how we communicate. And like I said, like I mentioned earlier, we communicate via radio. The catapult officer has a radio, the plane directors have radios, handler has a radio, air boss has a radio, and he talks to the aircraft as well. But a lot of the times, a lot of the folks don't have radios, so we use a lot of hand signals. So now I'm going to get my good friend and colleague, Rhiannon, to help demonstrate a few hand signals. We tried to find a float coat, but we couldn't find one for her. So she's a black shirt today.
All right.
All right.
I'm ready.
All right, you're ready. So we're gonna. All right. So let's put brakes on. Hold brakes.
Okay.
There you go. As you see,
Hold brakes.
and you see over here, here's the hold brakes. So she's simulating that. Now we're going to taxi the aircraft forward. There you go.
This is like a test.
It is a test. And you're doing quite well. All right. Now we're going to turn the aircraft to your. We're going to turn to left, but you're going to point to your right. There you go. So now the aircraft would turn. Now we're going to taxi it forward again. And now we're going to stop the aircraft. There you go. So there's just a few of the signals that you would see. And what they do is that is the way the aircraft is taxied from its pre-spot position to the catapult or any other place on the flight deck. At all times, the aircraft is under the control of a plane director. At no time is the aircraft not under the control of the plane director. And the pilots are looking at the plane director. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more during the recovery, but there are sometimes you'll have an aircraft up on the bow at night, and they're just watching the director in pitch black. That's all they can see are the two little wands that the flight director had, or the plane director has. Speaking of which, we talked about daylight. We use hands. At night, we use our hands as well, but both our hands have flashlights in them, and the flashlights have wands at the tip. The plane directors have a white wand. It's a dimly lit white wand. And then the catapult officer, we had a red wand and a green wand. And that's what we use to signal the pilots to do different things during the launch. So that's our communications, kind of the way we communicate. Now, there are some key players. I will argue that everybody on the flight deck is a key player. We just highlight some of the key players that can yell and get yelled at. So we'll start with the air boss. The air boss, in this picture here, you got the air boss here and the mini boss. The two of them together control the airspace within 5 nautical miles of the carrier. They control all activity on the flight deck and activities down in the hangar deck. So they're very, very busy, and they direct everything. So they're in radio comms with everybody on the flight deck that has a radio. They have that frequency, and then they also have the ability to talk to the airplanes when they're airborne or on the catapult. Next in line is a key player, but like I said, well, all key players, is a CAT officer. So the CAT officer is responsible for ensuring that the aircraft is ready to go flying. He's inspected it as it taxis up to the catapult. It's configured for flight. He pre-flights the catapult before the catapult is used, make sure all the deck accessories are good to go. And then he is the one that actually takes control of the aircraft after the plane director gives him control. Basically, once the aircraft is put into tension, he then takes control of the aircraft and does the signals from that point until the aircraft is launched. Your plane handler, or the handler, aircraft handling officer, he's in flight deck control, which is at the base of the island. And his job is to keep up with and plan the movement of all the aircraft on the flight deck. And you see in the picture, here's the handler. Here is a scale model of the flight deck, and these are all scale replicas of the different types of aircraft on the flight deck. And basically what happens is as aircraft are taxied from their spot position to the catapults, they actually move these aircraft on the Ouija board. This is called the Ouija board. And they actually move these aircraft manually. You'll see the hand come out there and move them along as they taxi. And we talked about the blue shirts being messengers and phone talkers. That's what the blue shirts are doing. They are radioing down to aircraft, to flight deck control, the position of various aircraft, and they just use the side number of the aircraft. If you look at the pictures of the aircraft, you will see almost, let's back here just a little bit. Look over here, you'll see numbers are painted on the aircraft. And each of these numbers, series of numbers, denotes a type of aircraft: a fighter, attack, and a tanker, airborne early warning, and that's how they move them. So if 104 in this case, if aircraft 104 is being taxied, the blue shirt radios information down to flight deck control, and he'll move aircraft 104 on the flight deck just like it's moving on the flight deck. So it's a very mechanical system, but it's very reliable. It works when there's no power. It works when there's no lights. It just works very well. So we continue to do it. Last but not least, we talked about the yellow shirts. Here's a good picture of what we would call a cat spotter at this point, at this position. Your Fly 1 PO, and he's straddling the catapult as he taxis up this E2 up to the shuttle, up to the catapult to get hooked up and get ready for launch. All right, we're now going to talk about, we're pretty much talking about what everybody does. Now we're going to get down to the intricacies of the catapult itself. The heart of the launch is the catapult. If we didn't have the catapult, we couldn't launch fixed-wing aircraft. So we have here, we'll go over the actual catapult componentry here in a second, but what I wanted to do is talk about the catapult in broad terms with a little bit of a picture. The old saying, the picture's worth 1,000 words. Here's a good example of that. So here you have, this picture was done in 2012. This is an A7 Corsair, and then we've got the catapult here. This is the flight deck. Here's your catapult. This is your catapult right here. This is your barrel assembly here and your spears. And then this is the actual catapult shuttle right here. You see the 4 wheels. There's 4 wheels on the other side as well. Then this component here is called the grab. And this is your steam. Steam comes up through here through a launch valve, and when with the catapult officer or the deck edge operator pushes the fire button, what happens is this launch valve opens and a rush of steam goes into the cylinders and pushes this entire assembly down the catapult track or down the cylinders and drags the airplane down the flight deck. Now, once the catapult gets down to the other end, it's got to stop. So at the end of the stroke, it could be going 140 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour. Now it needs to stop. So what we do is we use water. We use fresh water supplied by engineering. Fresh water is in the tank, and then it is actually pumped through a set of rings into the water brakes right here. And what happens is spears go into the water brakes. So this is now filled with water. It's, if you can imagine when you flush your toilet, that's the way it was always explained to me, because these rings send the water into a conical formation going into the water brake. This water brake, or this catapult, will go from about 150 to 0 in about 5 feet. And for those of you that have, and many of you are watching today, I'm sure have been on an aircraft carrier, you have worked on it, you're asleep in your rack. Every time that catapult, those spears hit the water brakes, you get a nice thud in your rack. You can feel it throughout the ship. You don't feel the catapult fire. What you feel is the catapult stopping. So that's a kind of a quick down and dirty on the water brake and the catapult itself. And also, for the aircraft side of the house, this is how the aircraft is hooked up to the catapult. This is your launch bar. This system is called the nose gear launch system. Back in the late World War II, Korea, early 60s, we used bridles. Even up until the early 90s, we used bridles for some of the training command aircraft. Now, all the bridle aircraft have been phased out. All aircraft are nose gear launch. So we use a launch bar into the shuttle, and then we use a holdback, which we use on the bridles as well, a little bit different here. And I've got examples of this we can show you for real here next. So moving on to that, we'll do that right now. I'm going to show you what I just showed you on a graphic. I'll show you for real. So right here, you have your this is an S3A Viking. There were some comments last night on the Facebook post wanting to know that some people thought it was an A7 at first. Somebody correctly identified it as an S3. It is in fact an S3A nose gear. Here's your launch bar. Here's your shuttle. We've talked about the shuttle. And then on the back, this is the part that a lot of people don't understand. Well, there's nothing they don't understand. It's just never been explained to it. How the aircraft is able to sit on the catapult at full power and not go anywhere. Because you saw Rhiannon do the brakes off and brakes on. When the aircraft is on the catapult, the brakes are not on. When it's loaded up, ready to go in intention, the brakes are off, and what's holding the aircraft back is what it's called the trail bar and a holdback fitting. So what we have here is a trail bar. This is from the schoolhouse here over at the NAS Pensacola, where all the the new ABEs, H's and F's go to school or age school here in Pensacola. And this is the actual trail bar. This is a trail bar for an E2 Hawkeye or a C2 Greyhound. Also was used for the A6 Intruder and the EA6B Prowler. It has not changed one bit since the last time I saw one, which was 1994, except this one's painted white. So this part of the trail bar, along with this T-bar, tension bar, hooks up to the landing gear, and then the back end of it goes in the flight deck. And if you remember in the video, if we have time, if we don't have questions, and we have time, we'll take a look at that video. You'll see what's called buffer hooks pop up. And the end of this trail bar goes into the buffer hooks. So it's attached to the flight deck like this, the back end, and then the front end of it attaches to the back of the nose gear. So that, like I said, this is a trail bar for a E2, not an S3. We didn't have an S3 one because there's no more S3s in the fleet. So this is a pretty good approximation. So that's how it is held. So what happens is when the aircraft is at full power and the catapult is fired, what happens is this particular component is strong enough to hold the airplane at full power, but it fails when the catapult is fired. It can't overcome that force, so it breaks in half. And that's exactly what happens. One part of the T-bar, when it breaks, stays with the trail bar. And you can see it in here. So this falls back down the flight deck. This stays here. The other half of the T-bar, it stays with the aircraft and goes flying. And when the aircraft comes back and lands, one of the first things the plane captain does is take this out of the nose gear. This actually fails. And this particular component that I have is an actual T-bar. It's an actual T-bar that was actually used. You can see that at one time it actually fit together. And you see the difference between it is when it's new and used. You can see it had the necking before it snapped, and then when one that hasn't been used, it's all flat through here. So it basically stretches and then it fails and breaks. So that's used nowadays, that's only used on the E2 and the C2. On the Hornets, F-18, all the Hornet series, they use what is called a reusable holdback. So, and you see that in the video, what happens then is it clamps onto the back of the nose gear, attaches the same way, but what happens is that the fitting releases when it gets to that amount of force it needs to release, and this releases and falls down. Nothing stays with the airplane, everything stays with the ship. So a little bit different, costs more than your old school that used to break, but you don't have FOD. Every once in a while, you would launch, pretty rare, every once in a while, the part of the holdback or the whole T-bar that would stay with the trail bar, it would become disconnected from the T-bar and blow down the flight deck. So that's a hazard. All right, so now we're going to talk about what happens when the catapult and the aircraft are mated together on the catapult. So the aircraft is taxiing up. It taxis up. As it taxis across the flight deck under the control of the plane director, the aircraft will stop. It'll come over the JBDs and then stop. At that time, your trail bar operator will connect the trail bar. The shooter comes out and he's looking at the aircraft, make sure it's configured for flight. The flaps are down, the slats are out. For the aircraft to have folding wings, which are all of them, make sure the wing locks are locked. Those are flaps, panels, and pins. So those are the kind of things that we looked at as catapult dogs to make sure the aircraft was configured for flight. And then up underneath the aircraft, you got your topside safety. He is actually giving directions to the plane spotter who has the airplane keep taxiing. They'll lower this launch bar, and the launch bar actually comes to a track, and they'll start to come up the top of the shuttle. And as it'll get up to the top of the shuttle, and now what we're going to wait on is ensure the catapult is ready to go to the next phase. Once it goes to the next phase from first ready, is we will then be ready to go ahead and put the launch bar in what we call the throat of the shuttle. And what happens is the airplane taxis up just a little bit more, and this launch bar rides the top of the shuttle, and then falls down into the throat like it is here. And then we will take tension. So what happens is a topside safety. If we can pan back over here, that's what this ADE is doing here. He's a topside safety, and he's giving the tension signal for this particular nose gear right here on this aircraft. And what happens when that happens, the word tension is used because we're going to tension the entire system. If you can imagine, for any of you that were, grew up on a farm or had to tow a car with a chain or a rope, if you have slack on the rope, when that person driving the vehicle that's doing the towing, if he pulls out too fast and it tightens up that rope or that chain, it'll snap your neck back in the car that you're trying to be towed. Well, the same thing would happen here if we didn't take tension on the catapult. You could fire the catapult, and what would happen was all that force on the catapult would rip all this off. So what we do is we take tension to tighten up the entire system. So now the aircraft's at full power, the tension's out, aircraft's full power. The pilot is doing a control wipeout, make sure all the flight controls are clear. And then at the same time, the shooter's watching this from his vantage point on the flight deck. And he will then be looking for a thumbs up from the white shirts that we talked about earlier, looking for a thumbs up from them. He's looking for a green bow safety. He's looking for a final ready shot or final ready signal from the deck edge operator. And he's looking for a salute from the pilot. When the pilot salutes, that tells the shooter the pilot and the crew in the aircraft are ready to go. The shooter does one final sweep, checks the steam, checks wind direction, velocity, and CSV, make sure everything's good to go. And then he goes down and touches the deck edge, then does a final clear as well and hits the launch button. And the aircraft goes down the catapult track from 0 to about 150 in about 2 seconds. So that's kind of the down and dirty in 20 or so minutes of how we prep and launch an aircraft.
So hey Marty, we've got a few questions today from our Facebook Live viewers.
Okay.
So Biff says, what are the differences between CVN flight deck ops, Gator flight deck ops, and small boy flight deck ops?
That's a good question. Now, today we talked about CVN flight ops, and I'll tell you the difference between the small boy, Gator, they're all very similar. They're all governed by the same type of NATOS procedures. The big difference are the aircraft. On a small boy, you typically have helicopters, and nowadays you even have UAVs that are operated and launched and recovered. On your Gators, they're a big deck. They're considered big deck carriers, but they operate helicopters and they operate Harriers. So, and soon to be F-35B. So that's a big difference there. There's no catapults, there's no racing gear on the big deck amphibs, but the processes are all the same. Just there's not the different equipment is used. And in the case of the Gators, there's a lot of equipment you don't need because they can do their own thing. And then I think the last was CVN, and we just went over that. And there's no difference between CVN and CV. I was a CV shooter, not a CVN shooter, but all the procedures were the same.
So Antonio says, is there a new way to launch an aircraft other than steam?
There is a new way, and Gerald R. Ford is the first carrier to have that. It's called EMALS. And EMALS is an electromagnetic system. I get the best way to explain it, because I'm not an EMALS guru by any stretch, but if you think about your amusement park rides, they use a magnetic pulse that goes down the track, and that magnetic pulse drags the shuttle by a magnet. So it's a much different system. And the big, you hear a lot of things in the news about, well, some people like steam better. I think a lot of us like steam because we're comfortable with it. All of us old guys, we like the smell of the steam. The EMALS is very clean, and it'll only take time to figure out. But my guess is that EMALS will be a lot less labor intensive to maintain. The one thing that we didn't talk about earlier about the green shirts. Your green shirts, your catapult crews and your resting gear crews, they operate all this equipment, and they also maintain it. So if the flight deck is open and flying for operations from 10 in the morning until 10 at night, till 2200, after that 12-hour shift, those green shirts, the finish they get done with that last launch, they are below decks doing routine, scheduled, and preventative maintenance on the catapults. So they may not go to bed until 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning.
So Cindy Thompson asks, how often does all this equipment have to be changed out?
Well, we have things called R checks. We have most of it is on time or evolutions. So it just depends if you fly a lot, which when the ship is on deployment or underway, the intent is to fly. So if you do a lot of flying, you do a lot of maintenance. And then you have things that fail and you have to replace them. So it's a lot of work.
So we got a question, how much water is in the water bank?
The water breaks, that's a good question, and I would have to go back and look at the books to figure that out, because I'm not going to lie and come up with some number. But I'll get back to you on Facebook tonight with that answer.
So Chris Meeker says, please discuss the importance of the ship's engineering in relation to JBD cooling and the steam for the catapults.
That's a good point. Ship's engineering, like I said, this is a team sport, and every part of the ship contributes to each other. And what ship's engineering does a lot. Number one, it propels the ship through the water, which gives us wind over deck that allows us to launch airplanes. They give us the steam to operate the catapult. They give us steam to warm up the catapult. They give us steam to put out fires in the catapult. They give us salt water to cool the JBDs, and they give us fresh water to fill up the water breaks. Those are just some of the major contributions that ship's engineering does for the air department.
So Freddie asks, have any T-bars gotten lost on takeoff?
Gotten lost on takeoff. Like I said, with the old school, like the E2 Hawkeye, the T-bar, when it breaks in half, sometimes in my time on the flight deck, I can only think of times when I was on the deck, maybe once or twice in 2 years. And I won't say it was lost, we found it, but you don't want to be hit by it because it's in the jet blast or the prop wash of the aircraft that was launched. And what happens is it will blow off the flight deck and it'll blow up over the JBD typically. But usually we can find that stuff. But typically, if we have anything that is missing on the flight deck during any evolution, the air boss and the handler will shut the flight deck down and we'll do what's called a combat fog walk down. And that usually is done pretty quickly, but that's how we would take care of that.
So we got time for one last question, and it comes from Mr. Ron Kelly. He says, hey, Marty, can you discuss why shooting from the deck is way cooler than shooting from the bubble?
Ron, always good to hear from you. And Ron and I were shooters together on Kitty Hawk. I think he was about a year behind me. So we shot together for about a year. And so when we went through shooter school back in the early 90s, back then you still had many deck shooter carriers. Kitty Hawk class, Forstall class were still in vogue. And you had a few nukes, you had Nimitz class carriers, but not as many as you do now. So when we were in shooter school, you had your deck shooters and you had your bubble shooters. So the rivalry started there at shooter school of which one was better. And I'm not going to lie, I wanted to be on Kitty Hawk because I was going to be a deck shooter. I would never have to go into the bubble because when you're in the bubble, and we can pan over here if you like, Donald. Here's the bubble here. And here's a shooter in the bubble. And the big difference is that the shooter on the bubble actually pushes the fire button. When the shooter's on the flight deck, he gives a signal to a deck edge operator to hit that fire button. But I mean, the way I look at it, who doesn't want to be out there in the fresh air? That's one of the reasons I liked it was working on the flight deck all the time. I'm in the fresh air, although it smells like jet exhaust. It was a very exciting environment. So if you look at the video, that video that we showed earlier was a Nimitz class carrier. You'll notice that all the shooters who have the bubble, they want to be shooting on the flight deck. I think that speaks volumes.
Thanks, Marty.
You bet. Thanks, Rihanna.
So thanks, everyone, for joining us today for History Up Close, featuring Commander Marty Martin as he talked about launch sequences on an aircraft carrier. So we've got something really exciting next week for you. We're featuring Homefront USA with Buddy Macon, our Deputy Director of the museum, Tuesday, April 21st at 11 a.m. Central Time. Please be sure to join us and have a great day.